Welcome, 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 ladies and gentlemen. Nice to see you here at Konstakademien on our special lecture, our jubileum lecture. Judisk just turned 10, actually, in October, but we couldn't do anything in October, so we decided to wait until March. We knew that Necessary Angels by Robert Alter was coming out in Swedish, and on that occasion we decided to invite Robert Alter and listen to him speak about this iconic book that came out, I think, in 91, Robert? Yeah.
Yes.
91. So the program is as follows. Robert will address you, will give a presentation of about 30 minutes, and then there will be music, and then there will be a conversation between Lars Dencik and Robert. And I just want to say that Robert Alter is professor in comparative literature and Hebrew literature. He is also an author of many books. He completed the translation of the Old Testament in 2018, which will be another program on another another time, and has been working at Berkeley University for many years, but originally went to Columbia and Princeton, right? Lars Dencik is a professor of social psychology. He's also one of the founders of Judisk i Sverige. And as we mark our 10th anniversary, we just remember that on October 2012, when we did the program, The Transformation of Memory, Jewish Perspectives at Banch, the first big program that we did as Judisk i Sverige, Lasse actually was the moderator of that first session, which included also a live discussion with the 92nd Y in New York, way before Zoom and before it was a crazy experiment, but it worked very well. A panel in New York and a panel at Banch, and a great discussion. So it's very symbolic that Lasse is with us this evening on this jubileum lecture and moderating the evening. Lasse, would you like to say a few words about Robert before we invite him on stage? But in any case, I'm leaving the stage now. You will see me later. This will follow by book signing. Daniel Pedersen, who translated the book, is here, and was given out by Phaeton Flog. So there will be book signing outside and a nice buffet reception on the occasion of the anniversary. So enjoy the evening, and Lasse, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. Do I need it? Thank you, Lizzie. I just want to say that Robert, who is here, will come join me soon here on stage. He's a professor, as we heard. He's also a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Jerusalem, and he's a doctor honoris causa at the Hebrew University there. And he is a very highly estimated lecturer on topics varying from biblical stories. I mean, if you need a Bible, buy the Bible that Robert translated. It's full of very valuable commentaries. And then he also is a specialist on Kafka's modernism and on Hebrew literature. And as a matter of fact, we met before. Robert has also had an influence here in Sweden. He was one of the members of the academic board of PAIDEA, the European Institute for Jewish Studies, when it was created, and I was also a member of that board, so we met in that occasion also and had an influence somehow on what is going on usually also in Sweden. A book Robert is going to present today, and we're going to hear about that, is now here available in Swedish translation. It's called Necessary Angels, Tradition and Modernity in Kafka, Benjamin, and Scholem. And as we heard, it was first published in 1999 by Harvard University Press. And it is, as we heard, also Daniel Pedersen, who is a publisher of Phaeton Flog, who also translated the book. And About all these three protagonists of his book, Franz Kafka, Walter Benjamin, and Gershom Scholems, Robert states in the book about them, all three of them. They were intellectually intrigued by the modern condition, as well as of the dilemmas of Judaism after the breakdown of the traditional world of Jewish faith. So that is what the core of the book. And as a leading scholar in this field, Roberts is also an outstanding representative of what I would call the interpreting intellect. The interpreting intellect is an intellectual approach prominent in Jewish thinking with its roots in Talmud. And it is about discussing or digging deep into texts, seeking their latent and hidden meanings in the light of the prevailing conditions, and make interpretation of what these texts may convey to our current situation and time. This is what I would call a Talmudic attitude, not only to written texts, but virtually to everything that unveils in life and in society. And it is to a varying degree what characterized all these three protagonists, that they had this kind of Talmudic attitude to texts and to arcades and to whatever they write about. And it is these three necessary angels that Robert mentioned them. They are three, but I think they are actually four. Because we are lucky enough to have Robert here. And Robert is a brilliant exponent of this interpreting intellect. He is himself one of the fourth angel, I think, and he will elaborate to us now how they, in different ways, turned to Jewish culture, to theology, and were attracted to Zionism in different ways, and to Hebrew language to different degree, and thereby became what Robert labels them as exemplary explorers of the modern condition. So, Robert, please welcome up. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you for your very kind remarks. And I have to say, I was in Stockholm twice before, both times in connection with Paideia in its very early years. And it feels quite good to be back here. Okay, now everybody knows who Kafka was. Perhaps Scholem and Benjamin are less well known. So I'll begin by making a few remarks, just identifying them. Scholem was the man who, in a way, invented the history of Jewish mysticism, especially of the Kabbalah, but also of the earlier phase. And I think one can say he was one of the great historians of the 20th century, very widely read among academics today, even people who have no special interest in Jewish history and culture. Benjamin there's almost a cult of Benjamin, an academic industry of Benjamin now, at least in America. He was one of the most original literary critics of the 20th century. He had a short life because he committed suicide when he was in his 40s, when he was refused entry into Spain when he was fleeing the Nazis in France. To say that he's a literary critic is maybe a little misleading because there was something metaphysical about his thought, and that comes through in a lot of his work. Also, I think he's something of a culture critic. He wrote marvelous things about what happened to culture when photography and cinema were invented. Kafka, you all know. So we have three figures, all of whom had German as their native language. Both Benjamin and Scholem were Berliners, and Kafka, of course, grew up in Prague, which when he was growing up was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And so although he, of course, knew Czech, his primary language was German. I'll sort of get back to that in a moment. Now, what am I doing addressing this topic? First of all, I have to say I have roaming interests as a critic, which go up to modernism and even to postmodernism in literature, and back all the way to the Hebrew Bible. So I early wrote essays on Scholem and Benjamin and on Kafka, and then they came together in this book. What gave me the idea for this book was reading the correspondence. It's a fascinating body of writing, the correspondence between Scholem and Benjamin. Because Scholem left Germany in 1923 to permanently settle in Jerusalem. He was a committed Zionist, and he lived out his Zionism. So his close friendship with Benjamin from their student years earlier in the 20th century, and by the way, they were all born approximately in the same decade. Scholem and Benjamin in the 1890s, and Kafka toward the end of the 1880s. So after 1923, they saw each other once when Scholem paid a visit to Europe in the 1930s, but basically it was an epistolary friendship. And those letters are amazing. They deal with personal things. They talk about literature, they talk about intellectual history, they talk about history tout court, and they talk about Kafka above all. Because for both Benjamin and Scholem, Kafka was the literary modernist par excellence, and maybe the most important creative writer in their part of the 20th century. So now today we exchange emails, which you're lucky if they're 2 paragraphs long. Writing letters in those days was very different, and Benjamin wrote a letter to Scholem on Kafka, which was 14 or 15 pages long, and is one of the important essays on Kafka in general. So that's what led me to think that this could make a book. Now, let me say something about the cultural context in which all this came about, and then I'll zero in a little bit more on the 3 figures. They all grew up, as I said, in German-speaking Jewish homes. And their fathers felt that they had fully stricken roots in German culture, that they were Germans, or, well, I suppose in Prague you wouldn't quite call yourself a German, but they were German speakers of the Mosaic persuasion. And the Mosaic persuasion was not very strong. Their fathers really did not attend synagogue and were not parts of a Jewish community. But Scholem, as he was growing up, noticed something about the home that he lived in, which was, although his father talked a lot about his belonging to Germany, the social gatherings at the Scholem home never included non-Jews. It's not that they wouldn't have been welcome, they didn't particularly want to come. So there was some kind of signal there that this project of assimilation was an incomplete project of assimilation. Kafka felt the same thing about the Jews and the Germans, and maybe Benjamin to a lesser degree, but there was a kind of discomfort for all three in fitting into Germanophone European culture. Well, Kafka's case is interesting. I'll contrast it in a moment with Scholem's. When in 1911, so Kafka would have been in his mid-20s then, a Yiddish theatrical group from Eastern Europe came and took up residence in Prague for about a year. Kafka was mesmerized by this group. He went to their performances night after night. He recorded detailed accounts of the plays that he saw, their plots, the performances of the characters. He managed to become infatuated with one of the female actors, although inconveniently her husband was also part of the group, so nothing more came of the infatuation. And this group struck him as authentic Jewish culture, unlike the world that had been exposed to him by his father. Now, even that, I would say that Kafka was a champion of ambivalence. And he ended up being ambivalent about this also. That is, after a while, he recognized that these plays were rather contrived and didactic. In a cruel word, that they were pure kitsch. And at first, he thought they would give him a foundation for his Jewish identity, but then he saw it didn't work out. But in any case, he was drawn to this world as a vibrant Jewish cultural realm, unlike the one that he had known. And he took up other aspects, partly because of the Jewish theater, of Jewish culture. He read Gretz's monumental history of the Jews. He read a history of Yiddish literature. He read Buber's early translations of Hasidic tales into Yiddish. So this was something he was trying to get into. Later, I will come to that. He made an effort to learn Hebrew. Scholem, on the other hand, well, Gretz enters into the picture also. Somebody gave him a complete set of Gretz's histories as a bar mitzvah gift. And he plunged into it, and he became fascinated with Jewish history. He started to study Hebrew with a local rabbi, and by the some people can do this, especially if you happen to be a genius, and all three were geniuses in different ways. By the time he was 16, he had a total mastery of the Hebrew language, and he was studying Talmud as well, so he learned Aramaic and totally immersed himself in this world. And after he finished his PhD, he was off to Palestine. So let me now talk for a few minutes about the different paths that each of them took. In the case, well, I'll begin with the connection of each with Zionism. And I'll start at the top and go to the bottom in terms of the intensity of the involvement in Zionism. Scholem, as I said, became a committed Zionist. He settled in Israel while he was still in Palestine, while he was still in his 1920s. He was, I should say, politically an odd sort of dissident. One way in which the dissidence expressed itself was that he became part, a little bit later, of a group called Brit Shalom, that is Covenant of Peace, which advocated a binational state in Palestine of Jews and Arabs. Most of the members of this quite small circle were German Jews. There was one prominent American, Judah Magnus, who became the president of the Hebrew University. He was an American Jew, actually from near my hometown, Oakland, California. But of course, nobody in the Zionist community wanted a binational state, and the Arabs certainly did not want an Arab state. So I'm sorry, a binational state. So the whole project really never had ramifications. Meanwhile, Scholem built this new discipline of the study of Jewish mysticism, and at the Hebrew University he became a dominant force, I would say even a domineering force, because his personality was like that. Kafka, as I've said, had this more ambivalent relationship to Jewish tradition and Jewish culture. When he was young, he attended a Kol Nidre service, and he was deeply moved by it. However, it never had any ramification, unlike the corresponding experience of Franz Rosenzweig, who, when he was on the verge of converting to Christianity, he went to a Kol Nidre service, an Orthodox one, a Hasidic one, and he just said, this is the real thing. And then he became a serious religious Jew. But that was really beyond Kafka. And Benjamin, I would say, had a kind of course, he was a Marxist, although a rather heterodox Marxist. He had a kind of theoretical interest in Jewish culture. That is, he was interested in Jewish theology. Through Scholem, through that friendship, he developed a certain interest in Jewish mysticism, and he fed all this into his own metaphysical system. As indicated before, his thought was often primarily metaphysical. Okay, now, a way that I found in the book to sort out the links between Judaism of the three is the Hebrew language. That is, each had a certain interest in learning Hebrew. And I think I called my chapter on this topic on not knowing Hebrew. That is, Hebrew was the language that their fathers had put behind them 2 generations earlier. And those fathers all had a love for German language and the German culture in which that language expressed itself. So to think that Hebrew might become your language was, among other things, an outright rebellion against your father. Now, we all know that Kafka had difficulties with his father, and he wrote that famous 100-page letter to his father explaining about all the conflicts between them. And it certainly would have been or was shocking to Hermann Kafka to think that his son would devote any time to learning Hebrew. So how did it go? I'll go from bottom to top now. For a brief while, Benjamin thought that he should learn Hebrew. Part of the motivation was that Scholem was encouraging him to emigrate to Palestine, which of course would have saved his life. And Scholem said that he could somehow manage to get a position for him at the Hebrew University. So Benjamin began to toy with this idea, and he even had a kind of fantasy of mastering Hebrew, moving to Jerusalem, and becoming a latter-day Ibn Ezra. That is, Avraham Ibn Ezra was one of the great Hebrew commentators of the Middle Ages. And the notion of commentary, I'll come back to that, was something that allured all 3 of these figures. So he took some Hebrew lessons for, I don't know, about a year and a half, but he never made any real progress in it. And given the man's brilliance, and certainly he had mastered another language splendidly, which is French, and even translated a couple of volumes of Proust's novel. He had the capacity to do this, but I think his heart was not really in it. So he never became a user of Hebrew. Kafka thought about Hebrew early on, and in his last maybe 4 or 5 years, I don't remember exactly when it started, he began to make a serious effort to learn Hebrew. He studied it first with a local rabbi, and then a young woman named Pua Ben Tovim, who was what was in those days called a Palestinian, that not what we mean now, obviously, but a Zionist who had settled in Palestine. She came to Prague, and she gave him lessons. And he did make a good deal of progress. So we have among the Kafka Nachlass notebooks in which he lists Hebrew vocabulary words. And he got to the point of being able to write postcards to friends in Hebrew. And he began reading with the help of a German Hebrew, or I should say Hebrew-German dictionary. He began reading a recent Hebrew novel by Yosef Chaim Brenner called Shchol v'Kishalon. In English, it's Breakdown and Bereavement, which he didn't like very much, which I understand because the Brenner's prose was rather disorganized, and Kafka's prose was quintessentially polished. So he actually was, to a limited extent in his last years, literate in Hebrew. Although the contrast to the other two is Scholem, who, as I said, mastered the language by his mid-teens and wrote in it, but I should say, and he wrote a few important things, an essay called, I think it's called in English, Redemption Through Sin. It has a much better Hebrew title. It's Mitzvah Haba'ah Ba'avira, which is a Talmudic idea that means, well, if let's say you say a blessing over something that's been stolen, then this is a mitzvah that comes through a sin. But he uses it in a very different sense. He uses it to track the heterodox messianic movement in the 17th century of Shabtai Tzvi, which celebrated sin as a new kind of mitzvah. It was radically antinomian. And then he wrote a major 2-volume history biography of Shabtai Tzvi in Hebrew. However, he continued to write most of his scholarly essays in German. And I once heard him say to a San Francisco audience, said, I won't try to imitate his accent, said, but I speak 3 languages fluently, and they are all Berlinish. So, what I've just tracked with the Hebrew language is also true of the attachment to Zionism. I'll go from top to bottom this time. We have Scholem, the fully committed Zionism, who picks up and goes to Palestine while he's still in his 1920s. We have Kafka, whom I did not mention this, thought about going to Palestine. And even in his last year, he was by then living with his last love, Dora Diamant, who was the daughter of a very pious Orthodox family in Eastern Europe, a Hasidic family, and she broke from all that and came to Prague. And in the last year of Kafka's life, they lived together. She was the only woman he ever lived with in Berlin, well, in a kind of suburb of Berlin. And she was a good woman. He was beginning to fail physically then. And she looked after all his needs and loved him body and soul. So the two of them talked about emigrating to Palestine, which of course, given his condition of health, was hardly realistic then. And then Benjamin, as I said, had this episodic notion for maybe 1 or 2 years that he would emigrate to Palestine, but that never happened. Now, with this as a background, with the dissatisfaction of the 3 with their father's assimilation into German culture, what remains and what do they share? I would say three primary categories of Jewish tradition that compelled each of the three. And Scholem has written about these categories. They are as follows: revelation, after revelation, law, which is the content of revelation, but after law, exegesis, commentary. Because once you have the law written down, as is true in any body of law, you have to interpret it. So the three of them, I think, were fascinated by revelation, law, exegesis, but in what I would call a radically post-traditional way. That is, Kafka was drawn to revelation, but thought that the revelation might be inscrutable or might be perverse. You know, all those strange and indecipherable messages from above in the castle, that is the novel called The Castle. Scholem thought that there was revelation, but it had no specific content, which is almost the idea of turning revelation on its head. And Benjamin, I think, was allured to the idea of revelation, but could not, and he corresponded with Scholem on this, but he could not imagine what it could possibly be its content. And then we have the law, which especially, of course, in Kafka's novel, The Trial, you see the law is impenetrable, and it's perverse, and it's arbitrary, so it ends up not looking much like the law of Jewish tradition, but it's important. And then exegesis. And perhaps I will wind up with this, because that's maybe the easiest part of this triad of concepts to get a handle on. Each one of these three writers was drawn to exegesis. In the case of Scholem, I suppose it's self-evident. That is, he was writing on the texts of Jewish tradition, mystical tradition, and above all on the Zohar, composed in the 13th century, and he had to interpret them. You know, they're difficult, obscure texts, and he became their exegete, their interpreter. In the case of Benjamin, the interpretation was mainly focused on artifacts of culture. But he in one of his aside remarks, he said, "There's no pleasure greater than sitting down and working on interpreting a text." So you see how that feeds into his fantasy of becoming, going to Jerusalem and becoming a latter-day Ibn Ezra. In the case of Kafka, this is one of the things that makes his fiction so unusual. Especially the Trial and the Castle Um, uh, Less so, perhaps, in the novel that Max Brod called America and Kafka called The Man Who Disappeared. Exegesis is the way the novel proceeds. That is, the protagonist is confronted with texts, with laws, with letters that are obscure. And he has to mull them over and try to come up with what they mean, which is exegesis par excellence. So to some of you see that the mechanisms of Jewish tradition are constantly operating in these three writers. Above all, the mechanism of exegesis / commentary, but they're operating in a way that I would say is beyond the pale of Jewish tradition. So in sum, you have three writers who are deeply involved in Jewish tradition, stand beyond it, and use what they cull from Jewish tradition to be their instrument of modernist expression. Thank you. Okay.
So, but we will have
We
a
will
piece
now
of music
have a
now,
comfortable
right?
conversation.
I think we will have some music first, right? And then we will go to the conversation. And so I'm very happy to introduce Kristina Winiarski and Stefan Shea with Brahms' Cello Sonata. Please. I'm sorry? Only the slow movement, not the whole sonata.
Okay, thank you for the beautiful music, wonderful music, and thank you for the brilliant exposé that you gave us. Now, before putting some questions and starting our conversation, I would like to have a picture on the screen, if possible. Has that been arranged? Is Lisa here?
Oh, there it is.
There it is. Now, this picture is very central to the book that Robert deals about, and especially it's very central to Walter Benjamin. It is called Necessary Angels. No, sorry, it's not called Necessary Angels. It's called Angelus Novus.
Right.
It's called Angelus Novus. It is a picture by Paul Klee. It was painted or done in 1920 and was bought by Walter Benjamin in 1921 in Munich. And Walter Benjamin kept this as long as he lived. Right. Also, he left it sometimes because he was a very nomadic personality. And then when he left it, was rested with his close friend Gershom Scholems, and he willed it to Scholem. So after his death, as we heard about his suicide in 1940, Benjamin's suicide, for a while it came to Adorno in New York, and then back to Scholem, who kept it, and now it is in the Israel Museum, where I had the great honor to be close to it, to see it, and have it in my hands 1 week ago, actually. Anyway, this Angelus Novus is also the object of a famous comment by Walter Benjamin. When Walter Benjamin was at the end of his life, this was in 1940, he was on his escape, and he wrote something that's now called Thesis on the Philosophy of History. Mm-hmm. And there are certain theses in that, there are theses, and the 9th thesis is one of his theses on the philosophy of history, and it is about, I will read the text of this text, or it may even be perhaps on the screen. Can I have the text on the screen? Yes. Now I will read it for you slowly. This is Walter Benjamin's comment. A clay painting named Angelus Novus shows an angel looking as though he is about to move away from something he is fixedly contemplating. His eyes are staring. His mouth is open. His wings are spread. This is how one pictures the angel of history. His face is turned toward the past, where we perceive a chain of events. He sees a single catastrophe which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. The angel would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make whole what has been smashed. But a storm blowing from paradise has caught his wings, and with such violence that the angel can no longer close them. The storm irresistibly propels him into the future, to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. This storm is what we call progress. That is Walter Benjamin's last words to the world. Mm-hmm. This is how we left the world, and we should remember, perhaps this is in 1940, spring. Walter Benjamin is 40 years old, and days after this, he wrote this. He commits suicide while he was blocked. So, the role of angels is important in your book, and in Klee, certainly with Klee, and certainly also with Walter Benjamin, and to some less degree with Kafka and Scholem. But Scholem had many comments to angels also. Yeah. And by the way, when we spoke of Hebrew, I just read that, or recently read that when Benjamin was practicing in writing Hebrew, he was not so good at writing Hebrew letters. But there's a list of Hebrew letters that he tried to write. And from the top down, the third word that he writes is the Hebrew word malach, angel.
Oh, really?
So that is, it was already there. So then, my question to you. You write about 3 Central European Jews, intellectuals, who face and reflect on the progressive and destructive elements of modernity. It's about tradition and modernity. This is your title of your book. And you state that each of them, in their way, are exemplary explorers of the modern condition. Will you by this imply that they are in effect also, each of them, an angel of history? Are they, or otherwise, why do you label your book Necessary Angels? There must be some angels in it.
Okay, I think I'd like to start with, it's a difficult question. Start with how alien the notion of angels was to the world of their fathers. That is, there's one term I might have mentioned and didn't, which was the Enlightenment. That is, in a way, the German project, German-speaking project of assimilation, ultimately derives from the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment's notion of the rights of man, but also the rationalism of the Enlightenment. That we can forge a new kind of rationally constructed society in which every citizen has equal rights, and we are Germans like all other German speakers. The very rationalism was something that had come to seem bankrupt to all 3 of our writers, and I would say to the modernists in general, that is, rationalism hadn't worked out. So the notion of seizing on an angel, so someone, a figure that's redounds with beliefs from long past, was appealing to them, and again part of the rebellion against the parents, particularly against the fathers. But what you can see, and here I'll add Clay to the mix, is that each one sort of radically reconfigures what an angel might mean. You can see how, if you think of all the angels in Renaissance European painting, you couldn't imagine a clearer visual break from that iconographic tradition than Paul Klay's Angelus Novus. And Scholems, and clearly Benjamin's reading of the clay painting, which you get in the 9th historical thesis, is a very you might say, anti-traditional iconoclastic reading of the angel. Scholem had to deal with angels in writing about Jewish mysticism, but he was repeatedly drawn to the heretical fringe of Jewish mysticism. So those angels became subversive angels. Mm-hmm. As you could say, the clay is a subversive angel. And finally, Kafka, who didn't write much about angels, but there's one illuminating story where an angel breaks through the plaster in the ceiling, and that again fits into this pattern.
Yeah. But why are they, to you and your title, necessary angels?
Well, I think it's although they were no longer card-carrying members of Jewish tradition, they felt that they needed the imagery, the iconography, the conceptual framework of Jewish tradition to talk about a reality which was post-rationalist. And of course, you can see this maybe most clearly in the fiction of Kafka, which I assume most of you in the room have some familiarity with, that he breaks radically with the European tradition of realism. And in order to talk about the way he conceives reality to be, weird things keep happening. I don't even have to enumerate them. But among other of the weird things is an angel coming down through the plaster of the ceiling.
Fine. Let's continue with Kafka when you mention him now. One little note when you said that he went to this Yom Kippur or was Kol Nidre, but he was not into Judaism otherwise in many ways. But I know that when he met Dora Diamant, I think it was at the Ostsee in a place called Müritz where he's playing. Yeah. She was a caretaker or in charge of a home for children.
Right, she was.
And she brought him to the first Shabbat ceremony that he ever attended.
Right.
So he was already in 40 close. So he had no traditional training in
no,
not at all. But then I will put question because then they make both Benjamin and Scholem make very strange comments on Kafka, I find, according to his Jewishness. But because you in your book you write about how Benjamin struggled with his essay on Kafka, which was very important to him. And in 1934 he sent this essay to Scholem, who commented and who agreed on many points, but disagreed on one particular point, namely the role of revelation. Which he said that they were disagreeing, or he almost accused him for not taking that. But interestingly enough, the same year, Benjamin was a Marxist at that time,
right?
And he was close to Bert Brecht, and he went to Svendborg in Denmark, where Brecht went to escape Nazism, and brought his essay. To Brecht, whom he, I think, in a way, admired and waited for long to have his comment, to Brecht's comment on his essay. Brecht didn't say anything for 3 weeks, and Benjamin went around there, and then they had a discussion, and Brecht was not particularly satisfied. It was not politically useful, and he wrote in his diary, you quote it. This was in 1934, that he kind of rejected Benjamin's approach to Kafka as, I quote, advanced Jewish fascism.
Yes, a notorious comment.
Yeah, well, it is quite strange to write advanced Jewish fascism in 1934. This is just before the Nuremberg laws are written.
Right.
And then he used, and then afterwards, the same year, 1935, when then the laws came, Benjamin, in fact, published his essay in a Zionist Jüdische Rundschau. Now, the comments that they make on Scholem and Benjamin in exchange is I think it is Benjamin who kind of teases Scholem and writes in a letter to Scholem, and I quote, "Humor is the ultimate secret of Kafka's traditions-obsessed fiction." I mean, I don't think humor. And then, right. Then he adds, "I think the key to Kafka's work is likely to fall in the hands of the one who is able to extract the comic aspects of Jewish theology."
Right.
I mean, this is...
It's a wonderful remark.
But can you explore this to me, the comic aspects of Jewish theology? What is it? Yeah,
that's one of those wonderful paradoxical remarks. Yeah. But I have to say about Brecht, he was a hard man, a ruthless man,
certainly,
in a way. And out of his rather dogmatic Marxism, he allowed himself to say that this essay advanced the cause of Jewish fascism, which I think is a horrible thing.
Yeah, of course.
Now here's something we know about Kafka. He, of course, none of his novels were completed, and none was published in his lifetime. But he relished reading his unfinished work to friends, and evidently it was not uncommon for his listeners in a small circle of friends to crack up in laughter listening to what he said. Now, that seems strange because there are horrible things that happen in Kafka, and there are certainly works of Kafka which by no stretch you could connect with humor.
Yeah.
Like, there's nothing funny about in the penal colony. But I think that the grotesqueness that Kafka cultivated in his fiction could because we take it very seriously. It's all about the anguish of an alienated, estranged man, and so on and so forth. But the grotesqueness of many of the figures and many of the situations could also seem to be funny. And laughter is a way, among other things, of responding to the inappropriate, like as Bergson wrote about comedy, you see the dignified man walking down the street with his top hat and his morning coat and so forth, and he slips on a banana peel and goes smack onto the sidewalk, and you burst into laughter. And there are things like that in Kafka.
Yeah. Well, that's Kafka. Well, let's focus a little bit on Benjamin again. And in a broader sense, because in your book, and I think the book reflects what in these three intellectual figures that you can name necessary angels, there are lots of concepts that occur frequently that have to do with time in a way. You speak about tradition, of course,
Right.
modernity, remembrance, history, memory, archaic, the past. Everything is it's on a temporal scale, more here and there, and everything is embedded in the womb of time. And you write in a comment to Benjamin, I think, that what is essential here is a tension between past and future. It is in that tension that they operate, so to say. And before he committed suicide, Benjamin, it was in Portbou in Spain, he made a comment to his own comments. And I read that quote, that's a short comment, that he says, "It is well known that Jews were forbidden to look into the future. The Torah and the prayers instruct them, by contrast, in remembrance. For that reason, the future did not, however, turn into homogeneous and empty time for the Jews. For in every second was the narrow gate through which the Messiah could enter." In every second that could happen. So this is how he. So you have in this quote, of course, time again, future and remembrance, and a revelation again. The Messiah is somehow coming. So it has been said elsewhere that Judaism has historically not been built anything of importance in space. No cathedrals, no big monuments, nothing in space.
That's
But we have a temple in time. Heschel, the
Yes,
said we have a temple in time. And it seems that, if that's my interpretation, my exegesis, that you would regard Kafka and Benjamin and Scholem as a kind of angels in the temple of time. Would you agree that that could be a definition of them? And how do they differ in their role of being angels in the temple of time?
Yeah, that's complicated. Well, first I'll say this. I want to go back to my remark about the Enlightenment.
Oh, yeah.
The Enlightenment was strictly forward-looking. That is, we are capable of making progress, and using our rational faculty, we will make progress. And in a way, the communism was an extreme form of Enlightenment thinking in this regard. So Benjamin was caught between two radically different notions. That is, in the French version of the International, du passé faisons table rasa. We wipe out the past.
Yes.
So Benjamin, of course, internalized that, but at the same time, he internalized a concept of Jewish tradition, which is that the past is everything. That is, the imperative zachor, which begins in the Bible.
Me remembrance.
Yeah, right. Remember, Jews are always remembering. So now, the way this differs among the three, just off the top of my head, it's only the top of my head that's involved here. In the case of Benjamin, I think that it's a kind of general, you might say, abstract concept that remembrance is important. The angel of history is looking backwards.
Yes.
In the case of Kafka, he was trying to look through the lens of tradition back into the Jewish past, and maybe his aphoristic reflections on biblical texts are part of that. And he and Dora Diamant in that last year together, he even dabbled a little bit with studying Talmud together. In the case of Scholem, he went deep into the Jewish past, but he chose the Jewish past which was not the Orthodox Jewish past.
Yes, that's true. I think, how do we do with time? Where is Lizzie here around? How? What? Sorry. Go on, okay. Fine. There time. When we speak of time, there is also an end. And I'm thinking of the end of these three protagonists of your book. In a way, I felt that they encounter each of them in one way or another, a kind of betrayal. Benjamin was a Marxist for a time.
Yeah.
And felt that Marxism betrayed him. He left it. Scholem, as you said, was a Zionist, but he was a Zionist of a special kind. He belonged to the tradition of Zionism that is not today the Zionism that you see in the State of Israel. He was more to the Achad Ha'am, to the spiritual school, and he also, in that sense, felt betrayed by Zionism. And Kafka, of course, was betrayed by life itself.
Yes, that's well put.
They ended very differently, the three of them. And would you say that they were not seeking fulfillment, but would they see that they reached, each of them, some goal of their life? They died young. I mean, Benjamin was young, Kafka was young, they were 40. And they lived through a tragedy, which I find, interesting enough, not touched upon so much by them. I mean, Benjamin had a brother who was killed by the Nazis.
Right.
Scholem had a brother who was killed by the Nazis. In the end of the 1930s, they were both in their kind of blooming age. They didn't devote so much interest, at least as we can read, to the world they lived in. They were committed to write what they became their major oeuvre. So how do you explain that they lived in these very terrible times? And Benjamin wrote his Arcades project, and Scholem wrote his book about mysticism, and the world collapsed around them. Is it a way was it a kind of intellectual opposition to what was going on?
Yeah, I think that's right. By the way, to the tragedies, one must add that all three of Kafka's sisters were murdered by the Nazis.
Yes.
So that's a very grim shadow. I think Benjamin at one point in his riveting correspondence between them says to Scholem that in these dark, chaotic times, it is above all important for us to go on with our work, to erect, this is now not his metaphor but mine, to erect a kind of monument to humanistic civilization in a time that is destroying it all. And of course, of the three, Scholem was the only one to bring that aspiration to a kind of completion. That is, Kafka was constantly dissatisfied with his own writing. ended up producing absolutely original work, but pretty much in fragments, including the 3 novels, all of which are basically fragmentary.
And so did Benjamin, his whole
and,
thing.
right, and Benjamin wrote essays from time to time, which were dazzling. I think my favorite is the work of art in the age of mechanical reproduction. But there are others. The Storyteller is a dazzling. But they were essays. They were episodic, you might say. And he had this grand scheme called the Arcades Project to write a kind of history of the 19th century through its cultural artifacts, but all he left were fragments. Scholem, of course, who lived a long life, he died in his 80s, and who was, of the 3, the one who was most relentless, I would say unforgivingly relentless about pursuing his own work, left the monumental biography of Shabtai Tzvi and left major trends in Jewish mysticism, also many important essays. But major trends, I think, is a direct answer to your question. He wrote it in 1938, when it was clear that we are on the brink of a world war, and when the whole world of German Jewry had already been utterly shattered. And it was important for him to put this together, and he did.
Yeah, I think Benjamin wrote in one note that fragments are more important than the completed work.
Right.
They are more valuable. I mean, the completed work is already partly dead, but the fragments are still alive and from them you can explore more things. You can get more out of it than you have from finished work.
But of course, that was also, that statement was a kind of self-justification.
Of course, as so many statements are.
Right. Including probably half the things you and I have said this evening.
There is one thing, if I have time to go, when you mention one of the interesting works, and that's in 1928, Benjamin published a compilation of short and aphoristic philosophical texts called Einbahnstraße, one way.
Yes.
The one-way street. And there is an interesting opening page in this book. It reads, Einbahnstraße, one-way street. This street is named Ashalatzi Street, since she is an engineer, that she as an engineer has broken it through in the author. So who was she? Ashalatzi, who Walter Benjamin met in Capri in 1924, was a young Latvian Bolshevik. And Benjamin fell in love with her and followed her to Moscow, because she told him then in 1924, then Scholem had just moved to Palestine, and he was here. And she said, the path of thinking progressive persons in the right sense follow leads to Moscow, not to Palestine.
Right.
So, and this, I think, was true for many Jewish intellectuals.
Oh, sure.
That
including in the United States.
Yes. So, and he never went to Palestine, as you tell.
He did go to Moscow.
He went to Moscow, yes, and he became a Marxist there, and he was under influence of her. But what I want to reach at is then when Scholem had read this book. Of course, they exchanged, and that's another story that I don't know if we have time to go into this very deep and profound friendship between persons who were very different in their views.
Right.
Anyway, so, and that in itself is a fascinating topic. But anyway, Scholem reads this one, Einbahnstraße, and then he writes him a poem. And the poem, the 3 lines that you also quote is, this is as Scholem, who writes about Jewish mysticism, to Benjamin. We are not pious. We remain in the profane. And where God once stood, now stands melancholy. And I think they both regarded Kafka in a way as a champion of melancholy, as the one who looked into melancholy with open eyes and did not blink. God is not so often mentioned in their texts, but there is something there that if you can perhaps, since we reach so high to God, I mean, how is God present in their...
That's the most difficult question you saved for the last.
Because he said, where God once stood, now stands melancholy. Is that a summing up of their position?
Okay, the way none of the 3 could quite get rid of the notion of God. Certainly none of the 3 believed in God in any traditional way. But Scholem once said to me, he was in San Francisco and we went out for lunch together. He said, human beings can't get along without God. If they push God out one door, he comes in another, in a different form. And I guess that's what he thought. Kafka, oh, this is really hard. Kafka, I think, was allured by the idea of God and was not willing to discard it. But the God that he imagined was inscrutable, maybe capricious, and maybe even perverse, like the Herren, the gentleman in the castle.
Yes.
Probably, as with some of the other concepts that I touched on this evening, Benjamin believed less than the other 2 in God, in any kind of God.
But he was a metaphysical. He was.
But right, he was a metaphysicist, and he also was not. He said, "This is an important concept. What the hell it means, I don't know, but we can't get rid of it."
Okay, I think we reached the top here, and I want to thank you so much for a very fascinating...
Well, it was a great pleasure exchanging ideas with you.
So thank you so much.